The function of pulmonary surfactant. Today we will continue our discussion of the pulmonary system. As we discussed last week, the pulmonary system is vitally important to our survival. It is through the pulmonary system that we receive our oxygen that is needed to replenish our cells and produce energy. The system is also responsible for the removal of waste created by the cell and tissues when they convert molecules into energy, resulting in carbon dioxide waste. Who can recap some of the topics we discussed last class? What molecule removes carbon dioxide? Correct. After carbon dioxide waste is created, it is dissolved in the blood and binds to a molecule called hemoglobin, and then is transported to the lungs. Okay, who can answer what is pulmonary gas exchange? Okay. Well, pulmonary gas exchange is the removal of carbon dioxide and the replenishing of oxygen in the blood that occurs at the level between the blood and the alveoli. This process occurs by diffusion, as we said, and is very dependent on the pressure gradient in the lungs. Okay, so that's our recap of last week. Does anyone have any last-minute questions before we move on to our next topic? Okay. So with the changing pressure gradient in the lungs that we talked about last week, there comes a change in lung volume and a needed change in surface tension. The surface tension in the lungs is controlled by a substance called surfactant, and that's what we're going to focus on today. Pulmonary surfactant is made up of a set of phospholipids, cholesterol, and protein. The molecule is synthesized by alveolar type 2 pneumocytes, and that assembles into multilamellar vesicles, and then are secreted into the liquid layer that lines the alveolus. So the purpose of surfactant. So this layer that was formed, it forms a film, and that film is responsible for lowering the surface tension. Surfactant is one of the many substances that has the ability to change interfacial energies, and the more effective substances that can cause this change are classified as surfactants. Surfactant is said to make breathing easier by lining the air-aqueous interface and reducing surface tension, which in turn reduces the pressure needed to inflate the alveoli. It also causes a reduction in alveolar pressure, which reduces the negative pressure in the aqueous lining. All of these functions that surfactant has is due to its properties, where one part of the molecule is polar, seeking water, and the other part is nonpolar, seeking air, and that's what's forming the barrier and the film. When surfactant is missing, many problems can be caused. Rugoni says in his study that when surfactant is missing, damages to the alveolar capillary barrier are very possible. It can result in pulmonary edema, respiratory failure, atelectasis, alveolar flooding, and even death. Surfactant is essential for the well-being of the lungs, as we can see with this entire list of problems that can occur when surfactant is missing. A practical example where we can see how the lack of surfactant can affect the body can be seen in premature babies. In these infants, the lungs did not develop fully, and they end up with a lung disease called neonatal respiratory distress syndrome. and it keeps the baby from having normal breathing. This usually happens because the lungs have only progressed up to a certain point before the mother has reached 28 weeks of pregnancy. The surfactant in the lungs has not had time to develop fully and be present in order for normal breathing functions to occur. Surfactant is found in the amniotic fluid in the right amounts needed for normal lung function at about 35 weeks of gestation. So these premature babies who've been born at 28 weeks or earlier are several weeks ahead of the time when they have enough surfactant. So surfactant, which we said is this foamy substance that's responsible for lining the surface of the lungs, allowing the babies to be able to breathe when they're born, and fully expanding their lungs. Without that, it's too much work for the baby to breathe, and the lungs start off in a collapsed state. So doctors have to compensate for the lack of surfactant by supporting them and giving them, for example, surfactant through a breathing tube or some of the many other clinical trial experiments that they've done with treating lack of surfactant. With these babies without surfactant, without any medical assistance, they'll be unable to bring in enough oxygen, they won't be able to support their organs, and they may even suffer from brain damage or any of the list of possible problems that we've shown here on this list, such as pulmonary edema, alveolar flooding, and also death. Okay, so just to recap, surfactant is a fluid that's secreted by the cells, the alveoli. It serves to reduce the surface tension of the pulmonary fluids. Surfactant contributes to the elastic properties of pulmonary tissues, preventing the alveoli from collapsing. As we said, surfactant is a complex of different molecules, so it's a lipoprotein complex that was created by the type 2 alveolar cells and the lamellar vesicles. We've said that surfactant has both polar and nonpolar properties, so it's both hydrophilic and hydrophobic in different regions. It absorbs to the air-water interface in the alveoli, so those hydrophilic groups will attract to the water and the hydrophobic tails will face towards the air. And it is vitally important to prevent atelectasis, or collapse of the lung, because if the lungs collapse, we cannot get the right pressure gradients to pull in oxygen and release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And surfactant keeps us from having our normal respiratory function. And without our normal respiratory function, our cells and tissues cannot get the oxygen that we need to be able to produce energy, and we cannot remove the waste that we've created after energy is produced. And so we will have way too much carbon dioxide stored up in the body and not enough oxygen coming in. So respiratory function and surfactant are vitally important for getting the body to function properly and to maintain homeostasis. All right, does anyone have any further questions on surfactant, the pulmonary system, respiration, before we end our lesson for today? Okay, so for our next class period, we're going to still be within the respiratory system, but we're going to move on to a new topic. We will be discussing inspiratory and expiratory neurons in the medullary respiratory center, along with influences of the pneumotaxic and apnoistic centers of the pons. If you have any questions, please submit them to the forum, and we can discuss them at the beginning of class next week. Please remember to prepare for the quiz, and I'll see you in our next class period.